Welcome back, everyone, to the top 8 of MXP Los Angeles. Coming up is our top 4 match. We've got Robert Cedar on Jeskai Control versus Edward Drew on Bant Nadu. And without further ado, let's just get into it.
Yeah, so this is pretty close to exactly what we saw last round. Robert Cedar's Jeskai control deck pretty similar. Robert Cedar's Nadu Jeskai control deck pretty similar to Gabriel's from last round, and similarly this Nadu deck. Not exactly the same 75 as a Nadu deck we watched last round from Edward Drew, but it's pretty close. Notably, still very much on the go fast version of the list, rather than the version running a bunch of Malevolent Rumbles and Arboreal Graves.
Do you notice any meaningful differences between the decks? Any meaningful new tools they have, or is it just going to be more of the same slog?
So I believe Edward Drew's list had one copy of Venser that we never saw come up. But that was a nice tool that Robert Cedar is not going to have access to. Sorry, the other way around. Robert Cedar does have access to that one copy of Venser, whereas Richard Neal did not. And meanwhile, from Robert Cedar's Jeskai control deck, sorry, these were somewhat messed up in my view. There's notably 4 full copies of Wrath of the Sky's main deck, and that's really, really important in this matchup. We talked about how it's kind of the most important card, particularly game 1, with stuff like Urza Saga, and so we're definitely going to be seeing game 1 at least is going to be all about whether he finds one of those 4 copies and can play it early. I imagine a Wrath of the Sky's next turn could be absolutely backbreaking if that's what he has.
Yeah, both players have just had slower starts, and with just both players just starting to develop on turn 2, Edward Drew with a hand that notably includes Shugo and Urza Saga.
Yeah, clunky start. Notably, Edward Drew's version of the list, I don't believe has access to like something like a Hex Parasite to get off the Saga. Even it's just the Haywire Might in terms of 1-mana creatures. So yeah, it's hope to get that Nadu out quickly or bust. But if there's a Wrath of the Skies here, that seems like it'll be backbreaking against this lower hand.
And there is a Springheart Nanchuko, so that way Edward could be able to make 2 tokens next turn with the fetch, but it's a bit slower of a clock, and there isn't that much real pressure.
Urza Saga, very similarly brutal against Urza Saga here, where it's just setting Edward Drew back a turn in terms of mana development, which is huge, and there's nothing to pressure it. So really just kind of gives Robert Cid all the time in the world.
Yeah, and this just makes sure that Robert's in control of the flow of the game. Edward's not really doing anything right now, and he can develop an Nantuko, but that's a bit underwhelming into 3 lands and a Teferi and just so many cards in hand.
Yeah, tough spot, particularly because we saw Robert Cid's hand. There's a dress down there. There's, I believe, a piece of red interaction for whatever the next creature is. It's really tough to run out this Nantuko and not get value from it. But at the same time, not doing anything into an on-board Planeswalker is just so tough. So I think Edward just has to accept it, hope there's nothing, and then probably end up very sad when there is in fact something.
Yeah, and just passing doing nothing is not allowed, so there's just a naked Springheart Nantuko that doesn't make any tokens, and I believe it's just gonna stay there for now.
Yeah. And I think in Edward's spot, the last thing you want to see, the absolute last thing, is God get left on top of library with that Seville land. Wrath of the Skies, the One Ring, both absolutely backbreaking cards you really don't want your opponent to have. And so you have to imagine that those are the primary things Robert is stopping in a spot like this.
Yeah, and the exact punish of Nadu to punish tapping low doesn't occur, and Edward's just stuck not really doing anything still. The constructs from Urza Saga are just going to get answered by the dress down, and Robert looks very firmly in control of this game.
Yes, there's dress down to kill the 2 creatures, counter spell to kill whatever comes next, and yeah, that's just really tough for Edward. Notably, there isn't really like a longer scale threat from Robert in hand. We don't see a One Ring. We haven't seen a Wrath of the Skies for really gain like a commanding advantage. So if we'd seen Edward maybe deploy another threat this turn, force that counterspell out, we could have seen a chance. But yeah, with the dress down answering 2 constructs and Edward spending a second turn that way, that's really, really bad because Robert gets to then uptick the Teferi, spend a turn, maybe waiting around on that, and then at some point downtick it to draw yet another card. And at that point, Robert is far enough ahead that he really needs to whiff for more turns than is reasonable for Edward to expect for him to get back into this game.
I think the name of this game is just mana development. Edward's sitting here with 3 lands in play compared to Robert's 5, and that's because the Urza Saga has been bounced and now sacrificed. And just having that much more mana to be able to play with lets Robert just do more than Edward is doing. And now that he's gotten out of the first few turns where Nadu has the ramp, the ball's in his court.
Yeah, I really like countering the Safekeeper there. It might seem strange to spend your 1 answer on something that's not really a threat, but I think at this point, Safekeeper blanks enough interaction in Robert's deck that you really just want to you really just want to keep that off the board, keep the total amount of resources Edward has available as low as possible, and then hope to find some sort of big card advantage spell. I think we see as many as 4 or 5 lands in hand for Robert, so this game's pretty far from over. It's just a matter of can he find some sort of haymaker in time or not.
Yeah, and the hand is a bit lacking, but Edward isn't able to commit to play much anyways. So maybe he'll be able to stay at parity long enough to just eventually find what he needs. And with
Yeah.
5 cards, go ahead.
Notably, with that endurance in hand for Edward, we see there's at least like some answer to some of the threats Robert could have, where Flage is not going to be enough right now. So we might actually see Edward kind of get to tread water for a little while, hope Robert whiffs for another turn or 2, and then maybe develop the combo, which I think is the one way Robert's likely to lose this game, is if he just whiffs for another turn or 2. There's not very much going on his side, and Edward will just eventually put the combo pieces in play if Robert continues to do absolutely nothing.
Yeah, Robert absolutely needs to find something, but he does have quite a bit of time to do so.
Yeah, notably he has a Galvanic Discharge in hand, so that means Nadu is not going to be able to kill Robert quite in this spot. I think what Robert wants most, far more than anything else, is the One Ring. That's his main way of getting back into this game.
Edward's just fetching, trying to find, I believe, a Surveil land so he can just dig to what he wants. And just
Yeah, we
improve
know
the
he has
quality of his
ample.
draws.
We know he has ample pieces of interaction in hand with ample combo pieces in hand with the cards we see.
Yeah, he just needs to. He's just trying to find a window where he can play one of the chords. And normally it's pretty good to play these types of slower games and encourage your opponent to tap out and give you a window. But I think it's a bit counterproductive exactly right now, where Robert doesn't have much going on and isn't going to be tapping low in the first place.
Yeah, it's time again. It's coming down to whether or not Robert can find that One Ring, find some lasting card advantage, or this game's kind of going to stall out. For Edward, I think it's a matter of trying to figure out the most efficient way to develop his combo pieces. It's like a pretty intricate balance whether you want to be guarding for things like Spring Art and Antigo to set up and then have less resiliency for your combo pieces, or maybe hold the cards, try and use them to combo, but then you risk giving Robert more time to draw something like the One Ring. With the copy of Minamo in play, Robert definitely not really uh, at a spot where Robert has a spot where the One Ring alone is probably going to get him there. He just needs to draw it.
Yeah, and he just needs to be able to get time while the awkwardness of having Cord is stifling Edward. And this endurance is huge. Forcing Robert to spend the Galvanic Discharge in the 4th energy is really a huge swing.
I don't know if Robert has a piece of interaction for Nadu left. The Discharge was the only piece he had in hand. I don't know whether he drew one over the last turn or two, but if he didn't, this could actually very well be game. There's 3 creatures in play for poster card with Nadu. There is plenty to at least get an insurmountable amount of cards. And if that's what ends up happening here, this game probably over, though there's plenty of reason to play it safe, and it's still possible Robert has a piece of interaction we missed since we didn't get to look at his hand very much.
It looks like Edward's just attacking, trying to play it without committing the chords to the stack, and there is a spell snare, but I think it's just that and a land in hand for Robert, and
I think there might have been a counter spell or two, so I think Robert has a bunch of stack-based answers, though Delighted Halfling means then actually drawn Nadu cannot be countered.
Yeah, and Spell Snare answering the Springheart and Tuco means that the beatdown plan continues to be just a bit anemic.
Yeah, I do believe Edward is winning this race, presenting for a turn, and there is still the threat of a Nadu just ending the game. But yeah, same spot we've been for a while, where Robert kind of needs to draw gas. If he does, he probably wins this game. But if he doesn't, then the game will probably eventually go to Edward.
Yeah, but I'm not sure even what gas gets there. Like, the One Ring is nice, but with a Haywire Might in play, it's only going to be able to draw 1 card before it gets answered. Oh, Wrath of the Skies is exactly what Robert needed.
Yeah, Wrath means that there's no pressure being applied. The One Ring, if it comes down, will be safe. And yeah, just pretty tough to beat, I think, from Edward at this point, because we know there's 2 counter spells in hand. There's no longer the Delighted Halfling to protect the hand-drawn Nadu, and so whatever the next 3 threats Edward has will get countered, which gives Robert at least 2 more turns to draw for stuff, and also we're getting to the point where the subtlety is just applying enough pressure that it's threatening to end this game. It's going to be a 4-turn clock after a fetch is cracked. And then beyond that, we're going to see 2 counter spells probably answering the next 2 turns from Edward, at which point the subtlety is down to a 2-turn clock. Stuff like Flage starts getting to lethal, and it's a really, really hard spot for Edward. Robert's looking pretty firmly in control.
And just 4 lands in play is not enough for these cards to be fully relevant cards. And that's the struggle with playing it a bit too safe, is that the chords don't really have relevance after the Wrath goes off.
Yeah, there wasn't really a convenient spot for Edward to play things differently, given the counter spells we knew were in hand. I think it's fairly safe to assume Robert has something going on. So I think his play of like saving the cards to try and maybe force out multiple counter spells in a turn and threaten combo makes a lot of sense. But yeah, one way or another, Wrath of the Skies is going to get you either by invalidating your cards or by forcing you, um, or by just getting rid of whatever actually gets carded for. If Edward chose to play more of a small ball game with that, so not really much he could have done to have prepared for that.
Yeah, and now Edward just needs to see what he can find as he just draws a card down to a 2-turn clock from Subtlety, and the counter spells are just going to answer every relevant card Edward can play.
Yeah, I wonder if we see something. I wouldn't be surprised to see a Storm Drake get involved at some point, just to stem the bleeding a little bit. But I think at this point it might be a little late for even that.
Is Stormdrake May, or will you force to trade it for the tap Subtlety?
It is not a May. You would be forced to trade for a tapped Subtlety. So last turn was the turn it had to come down.
Yeah, and the problem you run into now is that just doesn't do anything anymore, so. Oh, and that's a hasty second Subtlety for the game! Reign of Glory. Wonderful magic card.
Yeah, it really lets his Jeskai decks turn the corner a lot faster than control decks have been able to historically, with Flage plus Arena of Glory just being a lot of damage very quickly, and I mean, sometimes you gotta hit that your Subtlety. You gotta do what you need to do to actually close out the game.
Yeah, it's really powerful how much they can just turn into a tempo deck and say, you're not doing anything, let me just kill you and force you to commit. So you don't have time to make my answers awkward.
Yeah, and that can very much about mana advantage, like you said, where for a where uh, Edward's as a Saga being punished over and over, being removed in various forms of Dresta invalidating it, and Teferi bouncing it, really exposed the clunkiness of a card like God of Calling, and let Robert get far enough ahead that he was able to close out that game before Edward got the chance to deploy all the cards in his hand.
So last match, we said the Bant Nadu deck probably got more out of sideboarding than Jeskai controlled it. Is that the same here as well? Or is the sideboard meaningfully different?
I think it's a pretty similar spot where the sideboard options for the Bant Nadu deck are pretty similar to what they were before, where there's where there's 2 copies of the One Ring, there's Titania, 2 Veil of Summers, notably no Spell Piercers, but a bunch of pretty powerful cards post board. Whereas for the Jeskai deck, there's a lot less. Maybe even less so than last time, since the 4 Wrath of the Skies start in the main deck. We see that Supreme Verdict that might come in. Notably, only 3 copies of Flage main deck for Edward. I'm curious of whether he thinks it's a matchup where he wants 4. Another Dress Down makes sense, but yeah, really not that much coming out of the sideboard. I do want to note, though, that even though the matchup gets better for Nadu post board, I don't know that it quite gets to being good. It just becomes less unfavored post board than it is game 1, where you're playing into these Wrath of the Skies and counter spells without having tools to play against them.
Yeah, now they at least have a lot more of a fighting chance. And notably, I think that the Jeskai deck here is a bit more soft to Sun Cleanser, because with no Rending Volley, it's just up to Prismatic Ending and Solitude, and maybe Supreme Verdict to answer it.
Yeah, good call out there, where Sun Cleanser definitely applies a bit more of a squeeze on this version of the list than the other one. There's still the 1 copy that's in the main that can be carded for. Even post board, I don't think there's anything that's coming in that answers a Sun Cleanser other than the 1 Supreme Verdict. So yeah, could see that give Edward a better chance post board here than we saw in the last matchup. There's also notably not a second copy of Prismatic Ending in this Jeskai control deck sideboard, whereas we saw 2 copies out of the previous one. So just softer to Sun Cleanser on a few different axes.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see if that's enough to flip it, or to give Edward Drew more of a fighting chance, or if Robert Seed is just going to continue to just answer the threats and turn the corner.
Yeah, another thing I want to draw attention to is the lack of actual answers to the One Ring in this deck, where I believe this deck has no way of permanently answering a One Ring. There's counter spells are still within the stack, and it's Teferi that bounces it, and that's it. Historically, we've seen a lot of these blue-white X Jeskai control decks running a fourth color of land to be able to prismatic ending before to answer things like the One Ring, but stuff like Minamo and Arena of Glory really puts a strain on your mana base. It provides utility land strong enough to be worth playing, that despite producing only one color of mana, and that means that you don't get to run the free fourth color of mana, free source for that to be able to hit something like Flage. Hit something like the One Ring off prismatic ending.
Yeah, and I believe I saw that there was some number of force negations being boarded out from Robert Cedar. So that would mean that there's even less ways to exile it, which means that even if you counter it a shifting woodland, you can still start drawing cards in a way that you can't really interact with.
Yeah, pretty tough for Robert on that axis. I think it's very much about just hoping there isn't a One Ring that comes down at that point, or hoping you can counter it with Counterspell. So yeah, I think if we look at Edward Drew's ideal opening hand, it will be something like Delighted Halfling and a One Ring to force through with it as a way to win the game through the sorts of interaction Robert has. Notably, I do not believe there's a copy of Teferi in this Bant Nadu list, unlike the last one we saw. So that means there's not going to be that same axis of getting an advantage turning off your opponent's interaction the way we saw last round.
Yeah, the fairy being able to shut down the Jeskai deck was a really powerful tool, but being able to combo fast is also arguably more powerful. And it looks like
Yeah,
players
I
are
think
good.
I think in your opening hands, would you really want to see at this point, given the composition of this Jeskai control deck, is just threats that line up well against it? Unlike the last round, it's not about whether your threats line up specifically against the answers in hand, but rather whether your threats line up against the answers in Robert's deck, because we both see less interaction to deal with things like the One Ring, but we also see less interaction that lines up badly against specific cards. It's a much more middle of the road sort of version of this deck, where there's nothing like Rending Volley that's going to line up horrendously, and you're really hoping your opponent draws against your draw of all green creatures.
All these hands from their players, Robert has a hand with Prismatic Ending, Flage, One Ring, Surgical, and 3 lands. Sets up to be a bit slower, but have permanent answers, win the slower game if Nadu is able to get answered. And Edward's hand leans on Veil of Summer and Springheart and Tuco. Very different types of hands.
Yeah, we saw Springheart and Nantuko can kind of apply a level of pressure that is hard to compete with for the Jeskai deck with 1-for-1 answers. I believe game 1 of the quarterfinals, we saw Nantuko kind of take over the game while there wasn't a Wrath of the Skies to be fanned. So that plus Veil of Summer makes a pretty compelling reason for Edward to keep a hand even without any early plays. But yeah, it does make for a slightly one-dimensional hand, where this Jeskai deck is definitely stronger going into the late game.
Yeah, and with both players keeping a grindier-oriented hand, I think this does favor Robert initially. Especially with no play on 2.
Yeah, it's tough, where Veil of Summer kind of forces Edward to wait on deploying the Nantuko, try and keep it protected from counter magic. But that also means there's no play on 2. Even on turn 3, there's probably going to be a land that needs to be played before Springheart Nantuko, so that you can actually have Veil of Summer up. And it's a lot harder to leverage that value you're getting.
Yeah, it seems to be slowing down the deck a lot. And do you think it might be worth trying to commit more aggressively, or is it better to just make sure that your Veil of Summer hits?
I think when you keep a hand like this, you sort of sign up to try to making sure a Veil of Summer hits. If Robert's hand is more reliant on counter magic, this could line up pretty well against that, and I think that's the line you want to go for. Whereas if you run out Spring Out Nantuko and it just gets countered or interacted with, otherwise that it uh, with 1-for-1 removal or spell pierce, then you really fall far behind. Even if there's not a Veil of Summer left up this way, at least you can guarantee 2 tokens of the Nantuko by playing a fetch land after it. Whereas if you play it out on 2 and just gets interacted with, the whole hand kind of falls apart with that clunkiness of God really being exposed if there's no creatures to uh convoke it with and get an advantage that way.
Yeah, and here Robert is fetching, I believe, for another Surveil land. Just trying to set up draws. And what does he really want here? Is it Galvanic Discharge, Wrath of the Skies, lands?
Discharge would be pretty good. Just any instant speed onset and Nantuko here lets him use all this mana next turn. Something like tune the narrative into Wrath of the Sky is also pretty good, setting him up to answer the whole board here, rather than just a Nantuko with 1-for-1 removal. The problem with just Wrath of the Skies is it's not going to provide enough energy to wipe the Nantuko. But yeah, something like tune the narrative into it could get Robert set up pretty well, though would be soft to something like Nadu plus Shuko.
Yeah, and we'll see what. Or is this a counterspell to One Rings and Prismatic Ending? So counterspell's at least nice for if Edward just naturally draws and casts a Nadu, that would let Robert surgical it, but
Yeah. Now we know Edward has the Veil of Summer in hand, so that counterspell is actually kind of yet another dead card. Where Robert's hand here is actually 3 sorcery speed cards that you can't really afford to be tapping out for, with Flage in the One Ring, or at least are quite clunky to tap out for, and a counterspell that we know is actually pretty close to blank piece of cardboard because of that Veil of Summer in hand. So things are looking really, really good for Edward Drew here.
yeah, Edward's firmly in the driver's seat, able to try and leverage the Court of Calling that's coming up, and just trying to go for it now. Going to presumably get a Dryad Arbor for another token and the extra body.
Yeah. Not entirely sure what is in Edward's hand. I think there was Summoner's Pact, maybe. Either way, I don't think there was another land. So what this lets him do is have a 3-drop threat, either Nadu or Summoner's Pact for Nadu, and have Veil of Summer to back it up, so that you could actually just go for the kill.
One thing I like about that line is that he fetched for the Surveil Land, and with the trigger on the stack, he courted for Dread Arbor, so we had the information about whether it would resolve or not before knowing whether to top or bottom or bin the card that he would surveil. And it's those little details like that in sequencing that let you get marginal edges.
Yeah, it's definitely well played by him, well sequenced. This is actually a really interesting spot, but there's a Summoner's Pact cost for Nadu. The Nadu, I assume, eats a counterspell, and the counterspell gets Veil of Summoned, but that leaves Robert in the spot, or if he can answer this, if there's not a land drawn for Edward to Shuko and win the game, then if there's then interaction for this Dryad Arbor, either through a Flage with a Nadu trigger not hitting a land, or through something like Wrath of the Skies that doesn't target, could lead to Edward losing the game to his back trigger.
Yeah, and running up the Shuko first is interesting. Is Edward planning on playing more conservatively and just playing? No, there's no reason to play Sun Cleanser.
Yeah, I don't think Sun Cleanser is really an option here, but this does mean that Nadu is going to get hit by Counterspell, most likely. Yeah,
Yeah, and forcing.
So what
But
Layout Shuko does here is it lets Nadu guaranteed get a trigger if there's like a 1-for-1 interaction, like if there's a 1-for-1 interaction, like a galvanic iteration, or like some other way of dealing with the Nadu on the board for Robert. But
that's a
yeah,
surgical on court. Interesting. I think Robert just wants to see Edward's hand to know what is going on
yeah.
before
So
making any decisions.
this information is huge here, where now Robert knows that all he has to do is counter the Nadu when it comes down, flays the Dryad Arbor, and Edward loses the game. Once all this information is out there, the game seems pretty over to me when there's only 3 lands in play plus Dryad Arbor. There's not another land in hand. The one card that can do something is going to get countered by the counterspell, and then the Flage is going to take care of the Dryad Arbor to make for Path Lethal.
Yeah, and that's using surgical extraction as a peak is just absolutely turning this game on its head and winning the game for Robert Cedar.
Yeah, this is tough spot for Edward. I don't think there's anything that even gets him out of this. He doesn't know about the piece of interaction in hand, of course. He has to hope there's just nothing. But we know there is. The Nod is going to get countered, and the Flage hits the Dryad Arbor, and that should be game.
Yeah, and Robert's just shortcutting, saying, "Hey, I have the Flage. You're gonna die to your pact. There's nothing you can do." And once that all happens, it's gonna be game, and Robert's going to move on to our finals.
Yeah, pretty tough spot there where you have to figure out what interaction to play around. It hasn't particularly looked like Robert has a counterspell here, so it makes sense to like play around 1-for-1 board interaction rather than counterspell. But yeah, taking the line as Edward did made him definitely lose the game, whereas playing out the Nadu first would at least have given him draws towards a land.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah, really hard to know which set of interaction to play around, particularly when Robert has a lot more interaction for the board than on the stack in his deck.
yeah, like it's a tough call to make, and sometimes you just make the wrong call. You don't know what your opponent always has in hand.
Yeah, very much so.
And Robert's just taking time to fully playing out that line that he shortcutted, and yeah, that's the match to Robert Cedar.
Yeah, really well played by him, recognizing exactly when to use that surgical, leveraging that information fully, and then, yeah, seeing the line, seeing the way to kill your opponent with Pact. Well played. I mean, Jeskai versus Nadu is a matchup that has a lot of play to it. It can be pretty tough from the Jeskai side. You have to know exactly when to interact, when to develop your card advantage. You can't just sit back on your card advantage forever. You have to know the right point to turn the corner rather than just giving the Nadu deck infinite time. And really well played by Robert. We see why he's made it to this point in the tournament, why he's in the all the way in the finals now as a result of really masterly
Yeah,
play.
and that surgical timing was just wonderful. Like playing around another chord in hand was very impressive play.